They were not just meals, they were survival in a bowl. Thin soups made from scraps, stretched with hope and handed down with pride. What did we lose when we stopped eating like this? Potato peel broth was not made for flavor. It was made for survival. When money was gone and meat was a memory, the scraps took center stage. Families would save every potato skin in a tin on the counter, letting them dry until there were enough to make a pot. Onion ends, carrot tops, maybe even a garlic clove if someone got lucky. Into the water they went. This was broth built from rejection, slowly simmered into something warm, salty, and strangely comforting. A dash of salt made it taste like something you meant to cook. A spoonful of lard, if available, turned it into a meal. It was poured into chipped bowls and eaten with silence. It did not fill you up, but it gave you something warm to hold. Children learned to be grateful for what they did not have, and parents learned to pretend it tasted better than it did. In the quiet after dinner, that pot sat empty on the stove, a small act of defiance against hunger. There was pride in making something from nothing. Pride and just enough strength to do it again tomorrow. Cabbage core soup was born in kitchens where waste was not an option and flavor came second to survival. After the outer leaves were used in slaw or boiled down for supper, the hard, pale heart of the cabbage, the part most people threw away, was chopped fine and dropped into boiling water. It had a bite to it, fibrous and bitter, but when cooked long enough with salt and maybe a pinch of sugar, it softened into something close to tender. The broth turned cloudy, greenish, and carried a faint sweetness like memory. If a bone was lying around, even a clean one, it went into the pot for luck. Families poured it over day-old bread or paired it with a spoonful of lard. It was never anyone's favorite, but it was honest. It reminded you of how close the line was between waste and worth. Sometimes the older folks would say this soup kept us through the hard winters. Kids rolled their eyes, but they still ate every drop. That cabbage core, once considered trash, became the backbone of dinner. And in a way, it tasted like persistence, chewy, bitter, and unwilling to give up. Bread heel and onion soup came from the back of the pantry and the bottom of the loaf. Those last hunks of bread, too dry to enjoy but too precious to toss, were torn into cubes and browned in a skillet with sliced onions. If there was any fat left in the house, it got used here. Then came the boiling water, poured right in. It hissed, it steamed, it turned the skillet into a bubbling potion that smelled better than it tasted. But it did taste like effort, like someone cared enough to turn nothing into something. Children wrinkled their noses. Adults stared into it, spooned it up anyway. Sometimes a pinch of salt or a dash of pepper elevated it just enough. You were not supposed to savor it. You were supposed to eat and get on with it. This was food that filled space, not hearts. But it stayed in memory like a splinter, because even if it was plain, it was earned. You watched your parents stir that pan with tired wrists and wondered how long it took to learn how to survive without complaint. And that soup, bland as it was, always tasted like an answer you were not ready to hear. Vinegar. Hot water soup was a shock to the tongue, but a relief to the wallet. All it took was boiling water, a splash of vinegar, a touch of garlic if you had it, and a crack of black pepper. Sometimes a bit of stale bread floated in the middle like a soggy raft. The acidity slapped you awake, an almost medicinal burn that reminded you this was not comfort food. This was desperation food. And yet, some folks grew to like it. It was cleansing, they would say. Cleansing like scrubbing the inside of your gut with steel wool. But it was warm, and it filled the bowl. Children cried the first time they tasted it. Adults drank it with quiet eyes. You had to be tired to appreciate something like this. Tired and cold and out of options. It was a reminder that not all poor man's food pretended to be delicious. Some of it just existed to carry you from one hard day to the next. When you swallowed it, you swallowed pride. But you also swallowed proof that you were still here. And sometimes, that was the only thing that mattered. Flour dumpling. Water soup was exactly what it sounded like. Boiled water, a pinch of salt, and dumplings made from nothing but flour and whatever fat was left in the house. You mixed the flour with a little water until it clung together in sticky clumps, then dropped spoonfuls into the bubbling pot. The dumplings swelled and softened, turning the water cloudy and thick. Sometimes the dumplings were chewy, sometimes they dissolved. No two pots were ever the same. The flavor came from memory, not ingredients. Some parents told their kids it was their favorite meal as a child, just to make them feel better. Others stayed quiet. There was something hypnotic about watching the lumps rise to the surface, bobbing like pale ghosts in the broth. You ate it fast before it congealed, and if you were lucky, it stuck to your ribs just long enough to fall asleep. This was food that asked for nothing and gave very little in return. But it was warm. It was there. And when you had nothing else, that was enough to earn your respect. Salt pork and boiled water soup began with one single cube of meat, small, hard, and saltier than anything else in the house. That lone piece of salt pork got dropped into a pot of water, where it slowly surrendered its fat and flavor over the course of an hour. You watched the sheen rise to the surface, a slick halo of grease that promised at least a little richness. The smell was better than the taste, and everyone knew it. But no one complained. Sometimes a potato was diced into the broth, sometimes an onion, but often it was just water and pork, enough to convince the tongue that you were eating soup instead of flavored water. The meat itself was never served. That cube stayed in the pot, reused again tomorrow, until it finally disintegrated from overuse. That was the rule. You fed the family with its echo, not its flesh. It was not satisfying. It was not filling. But it was hot. It was something. And in a time when you had nothing to spare, the scent of simmering pork fat was a strange kind of comfort. It meant someone was still trying. Old Bean Water Revival was the second act for yesterday's pot of beans. After draining the cooked beans, the leftover liquid, thick, cloudy, and starchy, was saved instead of tossed. Into a new pot it went, sometimes with a handful of cornmeal, stale bread, or whatever wilted greens were on their last day. It was not quite soup, not quite stew, more of a porridge that refused to pick a side. You stirred it slowly so it would not stick. You added salt with a heavy hand and hoped the memory of last night's beans was still strong enough to flavor it. The smell was faintly sour. The texture was oddly satisfying. No two bowls were the same. And because it came from leftovers, you ate it quietly, as if the meal knew it was not supposed to exist. It was an echo of a meal, stretched past its expiration date, made to feed one more mouth. Some families even preferred it to the original beans. Others called it shame soup. But when the cupboards were empty and the paycheck was still a week away, this gray broth with its mystery lumps kept people going. It was a second chance in a bowl. Canned tomato and elbow macaroni soup was not glamorous, but it made the pantry stretch. One can of tomatoes, sometimes whole, sometimes crushed, got poured into a pot with water and a few handfuls of elbow macaroni. You let the pasta swell until it filled the pot with soft, starchy bulk. If you had a bouillon cube, in it went. If you had milk, you added a splash to cut the acidity. The whole thing tasted like warmth and metal, especially when cooked in an old aluminum pan. You could dress it up with a sprinkle of sugar or a pat of butter, but most of the time it was just tomato and noodle, red and white, bland and better than nothing. Kids would pick through it, looking for a miracle. Adults just spooned it in, chewing with their jaws and not their hearts. It was fast. It was filling. It was honest. And in a world full of dinner tables that asked for patience and sacrifice, this soup asked for very little. It expected you to show up hungry, and it met you where you were. No judgment, no surprise, just enough. Wilted lettuce and hot grease broth was an invention born of necessity and hunger. Imagine a time when fresh produce was scarce, and what you had on hand was wilting in the heat of summer. The solution was simple. Bacon grease poured over those tired greens, transforming them into something that barely resembled soup but could fill an empty stomach. The bitter leaves softened in the hot grease, which added a layer of richness and flavor that made it somehow bearable. You could stretch this meager concoction with just a bit of seasoning, and suddenly it became more than just a sad vegetable dish. It was a meal. For those who lived through it, the memory of that greasy, wilted broth could bring a sense of bitter nostalgia, a reminder of the lengths they went to survive. It was about making do with what you had, no matter how unappealing it might seem. Looking back, the ingenuity that birthed this dish speaks volumes about the resilience of those who lived through it, how survival was often tied to finding beauty in the simplest, most humble things. Liver and rice boil was another resourceful creation for those who lived through the leanest times. Organ meats, often discarded by those with the luxury of choice, became the lifeblood of many struggling families. Liver, kidneys, and heart, pieces many would turn up their noses at, were boiled with rice and whatever spices could be found to add flavor. It wasn't fancy, but it was filling. Rice, the staple that could stretch a meal, absorbed the broth from the simmering organs, creating a hearty, if not entirely pleasant, dish. There wasn't much choice in the matter. The bitter irony of the dish wasn't lost on anyone who had to eat it. What many considered awful was transformed into a lifeline. Today, we might turn up our noses at liver and rice, but back then, it was a reminder of just how resourceful and desperate life could become when the pantry was bare. Turnip top soup was a dish born from the remnants of what the earth gave. During times of extreme rationing, it wasn't just about the food you had, it was about the food you could find. Turnips, a root vegetable that thrived in the toughest conditions, were a staple in many households, and even the tops, the greens, weren't discarded. These turnip greens, sometimes a bit tough and bitter, were boiled with the roots, creating a soup that was as much about making do as it was about getting by. The addition of a bone, if you could find one, might give the broth a little more flavor, but the dish was essentially a minimalist soup, just the earth's bounty and whatever scraps you could gather. The turnip top soup became a symbol of how people learned to value everything, even the parts of a vegetable that others would throw away. It was a simple meal, but one that carried a deeper lesson about resilience and the idea that even when the world was in turmoil, there was still something you could rely on. Egg drop water soup was perhaps one of the most basic yet comforting dishes to come from the era. When food was so scarce, even something as simple as an egg became a precious commodity. In a time when the shelves were often bare and protein was hard to come by, the egg drop water soup provided a moment of nourishment and a bit of warmth. The process was almost magical. Boiling water seasoned with whatever spices or herbs you had on hand, then cracking an egg into it. The egg would swirl in the boiling water, creating soft, silky threads that offered a small amount of protein and comfort. It was simple, but it was enough to calm the hunger, even if just for a moment. In those days, simplicity wasn't a choice, it was all there was. And yet, something about that humble egg floating in a hot broth still carried with it a sense of comfort. It was a reminder that even in the most desperate of times, you could still find solace in something as basic as an egg. It wasn't much, but it was theirs. Celery leaf broth was another example of how people made use of what would typically be thrown away. The tops of celery stalks, often discarded as waste, became the foundation for a surprisingly flavorful broth. In a time when every scrap of food was precious, even the smallest bits were salvaged. The celery leaves, full of a delicate, almost grassy flavor, were simmered with water, creating a light broth that was both soothing and filling. It wasn't much, but in the world of rationing, it was enough. A little salt, maybe some pepper, and it became a comforting soup for those who needed it most. The idea of turning something most people didn't even consider into a meal was a reflection of the mindset that prevailed during these difficult times. Everything had value. Every scrap could contribute to survival. For those who lived through it, celery leaf broth wasn't just food. It was a reminder that the key to survival was resourcefulness, the ability to find value in what others had discarded. Barley and bone soup was a hearty dish that embodied the art of stretching the little you had into something that could feed the whole family. Barley, a grain that was cheap and easy to store, was often used as a filler, while bones, often stripped of any remaining meat, provided the base for a broth. The bones were simmered for hours, extracting what little marrow was left, and the barley absorbed the richness of the broth, turning it into something filling. It wasn't glamorous, but it was enough. The soup was an example of how, during hard times, the food you had wasn't just a meal. It was a story of survival, a testament to human ingenuity in the face of adversity. It wasn't about how much you had. It was about how you made the most of what you could get. Barley and bone soup became a staple in many households, a reminder that sometimes the most nourishing meals were the simplest ones, built on the foundation of what others would have called scraps. Dandelion weed soup was a bitter yet filling dish that many learned to make from the weeds growing in their yards. Dandelions, often seen as nothing more than a nuisance, became a valuable food source during tough times. The greens, when boiled, created a soup that was both nutritious and, for some, a bit of an acquired taste. The bitterness of the dandelion leaves wasn't for everyone, but when food was scarce, even the most bitter herbs became something worth harvesting. Foraging became a way of life, and dandelion weed soup was just one example of how people adapted to the food shortages they faced. The idea that something as common as a weed could feed a family was a powerful lesson in resilience. For those who lived through it, it was a reminder that survival didn't always come from the food you wanted. It came from the food you could find. Evaporated milk and cracker soup was the result of the desperate need to stretch ingredients as far as possible. A can of evaporated milk, which was more shelf-stable than regular milk, was mixed with water to make a thin broth. Broken crackers, often the stale remnants of a loaf, were then added to thicken the soup. It wasn't a luxurious meal by any stretch, but it was filling, and it was comforting in a way only simple foods could be. In a time when fresh ingredients were hard to come by, evaporated milk and cracker soup became a quick fix for hunger. The sweetness of the evaporated milk, combined with the saltiness of the crackers, created a strange balance that worked. You could serve it hot or cold, depending on what you had available. While it may not have been the most satisfying dish, it provided a moment of relief for those who needed it. In a world where food often felt scarce, evaporated milk and cracker soup was a reminder that survival often required making do with what you had, no matter how strange the combination. Corn cob broth was another dish born from the practice of using every part of a food item. After the kernels were scraped off the corn cob, the cobs themselves were boiled in water with onions and bay leaves. The broth that resulted was surprisingly sweet and savory, a flavor that came from the remnants of the corn. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make a simple soup that could stretch the meal a little longer. The corn cobs were a part of the food that would have otherwise been discarded, but during times of scarcity, even the most overlooked items were turned into something valuable. Corn cob broth was a reminder that when things seemed impossible, there was always something to be made from what you had. It wasn't about the amount of food. It was about finding the hidden potential in what others would toss aside. For those who lived through it, it was a testament to the ingenuity that came out of necessity, a lesson in how to survive when there didn't seem to be much to work with. Water gravy soup was one of those dishes that proved just how creative people had to be when meat and other staples were gone. Made from a simple roux, bacon drippings, flour, and water, this thin broth would be simmered until it took on the consistency of a light gravy. It wasn't much, but it was something. The bacon drippings, which were a precious commodity, added a richness to the broth, making it taste fuller than it had any right to. Water gravy soup wasn't about fancy ingredients. It was about making the most out of what you had. When meat was scarce, this soup became a go-to for many families trying to fill their bellies. It was the ultimate comfort food for tough times, a reminder that even when you didn't have much, you could still create something that made you feel full. The ingenuity behind water gravy soup was a symbol of how resourceful people became when faced with the harshest of circumstances. It wasn't just about food, it was about survival. and sometimes survival meant finding nourishment in the most unlikely places. Boiled pumpkin and onion soup was a staple during the fall, particularly in rural households where both ingredients were easy to grow and abundant. The pumpkin, a humble yet nourishing vegetable, was boiled down until soft, then mixed with onions to give it a savory depth. The sweetness of the pumpkin was balanced by the sharpness of the onions, creating a hearty and surprisingly complex soup. To make it even more comforting, a dash of pepper and vinegar were added, those simple spices providing a warmth that filled not just the belly but the soul. It wasn't an expensive dish, but it carried a deep connection to the land and the seasons, reminding families of the hard work and harvests that made it possible to eat through the winter. For many, this soup represented the connection between the land, the seasons, and survival. It wasn't just food, it was the warmth of the fall, the harvest, and the promise of getting through the cold months. While the recipe might seem quaint now, back then, it was a constant reminder of the cycle of life and the ways in which a simple meal could carry so much meaning. Macaroni water. Soup with ketchup was a quick, cheap, and surprisingly satisfying dish during difficult times. After cooking macaroni, the leftover water, often already flavored with a bit of salt, was used as the base for this minimalist soup. A squeeze of ketchup, that bright red, tangy condiment, would be stirred in, transforming the bland water into something that felt like a meal. It was the kind of dish you'd make when there was nothing else in the pantry, but you needed something to hold you over. The acidity of the ketchup cut through the simplicity of the macaroni water, making it unexpectedly delicious in a strange, comforting way. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. This soup, often eaten by families with few options, became a symbol of how you could take the simplest ingredients and make them stretch further than you ever thought possible. For those who ate it, the memory of macaroni water soup still carries a nostalgic echo of times when everything was stretched to its limits, and ingenuity was the key to survival. Greens and lard broth was a dish born from necessity, and the understanding that you could turn the simplest ingredients into something that could nourish. Mustard greens or collard greens, often seen as bitter or tough, were simmered down with lard, creating a rich, fatty broth that would make even the most basic meal feel like a feast. The lard added a deep, savory richness that transformed the greens, turning them from a simple vegetable into a hearty, comforting soup. It wasn't a meal for the faint of heart, greasy and hearty. It was the kind of dish that stuck to your ribs and kept you going throughout the day. For families struggling to make ends meet, this was the perfect example of using what was available to create something substantial. It wasn't about flavor as much as it was about filling your stomach, making sure there was something in the pot to feed everyone. Today, it may seem like a dish of desperation, but for those who ate it, greens and lard broth represented survival, an honest meal born from the raw, unrefined ingredients that the land had to offer. Rice and raisin sweet soup was a rare treat, a comforting dish born from the need to make something sweet when little else was available. Leftover rice, if you were lucky enough to have any, would be sweetened with sugar and studded with raisins, creating a simple but surprisingly satisfying dessert-like soup. It wasn't something that could be made often, as sugar was expensive and rice was a luxury. But when it was a special occasion, something that felt like a small indulgence in a time when treats were hard to come by. The sweetness of the rice, combined with the chewy raisins, created a comforting warmth that felt like a hug from the past. For many, rice and raisin sweet soup was a memory of childhood, something that, while not extravagant, brought a little joy in the hardest of times. The rarity of it made it all the more cherished, and when served, it was like a reminder of how sweetness could still exist in a world filled with scarcity. It was a dish that embodied hope, showing that even when everything else felt like struggle, a little sweetness could still be found. Hardtac and hot water soup, often eaten by soldiers and during times of extreme hardship, was about making do with what you had, even if it wasn't much. Hardtac, the hard, dry biscuit that could survive for months, would be soaked in boiling water, softening into a mushy, soggy mess. This was what survival often looked like, taking something that had no taste or texture and turning it into something you could at least swallow. Hardtac and hot water soup was a reminder that when times were tough, you didn't have the luxury of taste. You ate because you had to, and any sustenance, no matter how bland or unappealing, was better than nothing at all. For those who survived on it, it remains a symbol of the grit and determination required to get by when the world seemed to be offering nothing but hardship. Peanut butter and onion soup was a surprisingly common dish in southern kitchens, where people learned to make meals out of whatever ingredients they could get their hands on. The combination of peanut butter, which provided protein and fat, with onions, which added depth and flavor, created a surprisingly balanced broth. The peanut butter dissolved into the soup, thickening it and giving it a richness that you wouldn't expect from such humble ingredients. The onions, when softened, offered a sharp contrast to the creamy texture of the peanut butter, creating a unique flavor profile that was both satisfying and filling. It wasn't a dish that many would seek out for its taste, but it became a common solution during hard times when there wasn't much else to work with. It was proof that when there was little to be had, the right combinations could make anything work. Hominy and lye water broth was a traditional dish that required the skill and knowledge to make hominy from scratch, a process that involved soaking dried corn in lye water to remove the husks and turn it into a more digestible form. Once the hominy was prepared, it was boiled in water to create a basic broth. The result was a hearty, earthy dish that could fill you up with little more than corn and water. The lye-treated corn had a slightly different texture and flavor, making the broth both filling and comforting, even if it wasn't particularly flavorful. For families with limited resources, hominy and lye water broth was a dish that could be eaten often because it didn't require much. Hominy, once a staple of indigenous diets, became a symbol of resilience during times of hardship, an old dish made new again for survival. For those who ate it, hominy and lye water broth was a reminder that sometimes the simplest foods were the ones that got you through. Bread crust and milk soup was a dish born from the need to avoid waste and make the most of what you had. Leftover bread crusts, often too hard or dry to eat on their own, were softened in warm milk, turning into a comfort food that could feel like a meal even in the hardest of times. The soup was filling in a way that spoke to survival, to making something out of nothing. In times of scarcity, when every bite counted, bread crust and milk soup was a reminder that even the simplest ingredients, when treated with care, could become something nourishing. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep you going until something better came along. Sawdust cornmeal soup, affectionately named for its gritty texture, was a dish that became a joke among those who ate it during tough times. Cornmeal, a cheap and versatile ingredient, was cooked until thick, often so dense that it resembled a gritty, heavy paste. It wasn't much to look at, but it filled the stomach and provided the energy needed to make it through another day. It was a meal that was hard to beat when resources were scarce. Sawdust cornmeal soup became a symbol of how people could adapt to difficult situations, turning even the simplest, least appetizing ingredients into something that could sustain them. It wasn't a meal anyone would choose to make on a good day, but in a time of scarcity, it was better than going hungry. It was a reminder of how survival often meant swallowing your pride as much as your food. Kraut juice soup was an unexpected dish that came from the leftovers of sauerkraut, the fermented cabbage that was often a staple during tough times. The sour, tangy juice from the kraut, which many would discard, became the base for a surprisingly flavorful broth. Potatoes were added to balance the acidity and provide a heartier texture. The result was a sour, savory soup that was comforting in its own way. It wasn't a dish that was made on a whim. It was a practical solution to using up what was left over. The bitterness of the kraut juice was softened by the potatoes, creating a balance that filled the stomach without requiring much. For those who had lived through the Great Depression, kraut juice soup became a symbol of how every scrap of food had value, even if it wasn't always what you wanted. Apple skin and clove soup was one of those nostalgic dishes that was made out of necessity, yet it carried with it a sense of warmth and comfort that is hard to forget. When apples were in season, the skins, which might have otherwise been discarded, were saved and boiled down with cloves and a little sugar to create a fragrant, sweet, and slightly spiced broth. The apple skins, which had absorbed the flavors of the fruit, provided a rich, earthy base for the soup. The cloves added a warm, aromatic spice, and the sugar brought a touch of sweetness to balance the bitterness of the skins. This wasn't a soup you'd make on a regular basis. Apple skin and clove soup was a reminder that even in the toughest times, a little bit of creativity and care could make something beautiful out of the most humble ingredients. Rutabaga and pepper water soup was a simple yet hearty dish that became a go-to for many living in rural areas where rutabagas were abundant and cheap. Rutabagas, a root vegetable that could grow well even in poor soil, were a staple during tough times when options were limited. The rutabaga, often peeled and chopped into chunks, was boiled down into a soft, earthy base. The addition of pepper water, a mixture of water, pepper, and sometimes a bit of salt, added just enough heat to make the broth more exciting. The pepper's sharpness cut through the earthiness of the rutabaga, creating a flavorful balance that made the soup feel more substantial than it really was. Rutabagas, often overlooked for their tough, woody exterior, transformed into a filling meal when times were hard. For those who ate it, rutabaga and pepper water soup was a reminder of the resilience of people who found ways to survive on whatever nature had to offer. It became a symbol of the necessity of turning humble, abundant ingredients into something that could sustain you day after day. Hot dog and rice stew was not about meat. It was about the memory of meat. One single hot dog, sliced into 10 thin coins, fried just long enough to scent the air and tint the oil. Then came the rice, cheap and bottomless, absorbing whatever was left. A bit of celery if it had not gone rubbery. A carrot nub shaved into slivers. The trick was timing. Let the hot dog cook too long and it vanished. Too short and it stayed rubbery. But done just right, it fooled the tongue into thinking you were eating something hearty. The broth, if you can call it that, was barely more than salted water and grease. But it shimmered. And when it hit the table, steaming and pink around the edges, children smiled. It looked like dinner. It sounded like dinner. That one hot dog stretched like a miracle across 6 bowls. They never forgot it, not because it was delicious, but because it was enough. And sometimes, enough is all anyone is really hoping for. Corn cob broth stew asked you to believe in what was already gone. The corn was eaten, of course, but the cobs, stripped, gnawed, and dry, were dropped into a pot and simmered for hours to pull out whatever ghost of flavor they had left. The broth turned golden, sweet, and faintly smoky. Into that went whatever scraps remained: a potato, a handful of beans, a sprig of parsley, if someone still had a garden. The cobs were taken out before serving, but the warmth lingered. It tasted like memory, like summer's shadow. Some said it was not real stew, but to the ones who made it, it was. It meant nothing was wasted. It meant supper still came, even when the field was bare. There is something sacred in that kind of belief, in boiling bones and husks and peels, because hope is cheaper than groceries. Corncob broth stew was never about hunger. It was about refusing to believe the cupboard was truly empty. Oxtail stew is a true comfort food, perfect for anyone who loves deep, meaty flavors with a luxuriously silky texture. Despite the name, oxtail simply refers to the tail of cattle, rich with collagen and connective tissue, making it perfect for slow-cooked dishes. As it simmers, oxtail transforms, becoming incredibly tender and melt in your mouth, with a broth so thick it's almost like gravy. Loaded up with carrots, potatoes, onions, and warming spices, oxtail stew feels both fancy and wonderfully homey. Enjoyed for centuries around the world, from Jamaican and Caribbean versions to European classics, oxtail has a humble yet flavorful history. And here's a fun fact. In medieval times, oxtail was considered a lesser cut, eaten mostly by peasants. Today, though, it's a delicacy with prices to match. The key to perfect oxtail stew? Patience. This is no quick meal. Slow cooking it for several hours brings out its full, rich flavor while letting the bones add even more depth to the broth. For an extra layer of flavor, try adding a splash of red wine or a dash of soy sauce. Serve with rice, mashed potatoes, or even dumplings to soak up every last drop of the hearty sauce. For a dish that's both rustic and refined, oxtail stew is a timeless favorite just waiting to be rediscovered in your kitchen. The typical scrambled eggs breakfast has been more or less a national tradition for so many years, it is impossible to tell where it really started. Low-key, small-time diners, high-tier French-American restaurants, and steakhouses all serve some kind of variation on eggs, including scrambled-ons. Hence, what do you do to add a little bit of variety, texture, and a bit of spaz to this classical option? If mayonnaise can work wonders for a burger, why not try it here? No, seriously, you'd be surprised. We know most people never make the link between eggs and mayo, but they can actually make them so much more fluffier and add this nice creamy texture too. If you do not believe us, then just search up any grandma's recipe for mayo eggs. Do not knock it till you try it. Seafood was a popular protein choice, as clam bakes were a go-to dinner food in Connecticut. You could find a good clam bake plate for dinner anywhere from homes to restaurants, diners, and even pubs. Clams were a classic seafood in Connecticut because they were harvested and locally produced. Tomato bread stew was proof that two forgotten foods could become something unforgettable. Stale bread, hard enough to cut your hand, was cubed and tossed into a pot of tomato juice and water. Onions sizzled in lard before being added, bringing sweetness to the sour. The bread soaked, softened, and dissolved just enough to create a thick, almost porridge-like stew. It was crimson and steaming. The smell was tangy and sharp. Some called it kitchen mop stew behind closed doors. But when it hit the bowl, it looked like something out of Italy. Poor man's panzanella. Depression gazpacho. The names changed. The need stayed the same. It filled stomachs with warmth. It taught children to chew slowly. Tomato bread stew was not a meal you boasted about, but it was one you remembered, because it reminded you that even in the leanest days, the heart could still hunger for flavor, and sometimes it found it. Every spoonful of Irish lamb stew is like the warm embrace of the Emerald Isle. This signature stew is simple yet soulful. It uses just a few ingredients: lamb, potatoes, onions, and carrots, although it's perfect for a warm winter's night. But the Irish tend to do it year-round, especially on cold and foggy days when you need something hearty to cut through the cold. The star here is, of course, the lamb, which is so tender it's almost melting. But don't overlook the potatoes. They're not just sidekicks. It thickens the soup and gives the stew a smooth texture. During the Great Famine in Ireland, lamb stew was made from almost anything available. And this authentic Irish lamb stew never used any fancy flour or thickeners, just the natural starch of the potatoes, and it was delicious. You'll know it's done when you can't resist the smell. To raise the bar to the next level, add fresh herbs like thyme or parsley, and serve with Irish soda bread to soak up every drop of soup. This stew is as straightforward as it is satisfying, proving that you don't need a lot of ingredients for something truly delicious. It's simple, durable, and just waiting for you to warm it up. Something that is ridiculously common in Southeast Asian households in America, but a little less known to natives of Uncle Sam's residence, is that rinsing your rice with water can do wonders for any dish. Literally, any dish that involves even the slightest hint of rice. This is because rinsing removes the extra starch packed into rice, giving you fluffier grains with minimal effort. If you are the type of person who enjoys their rice soft, airy, and mushy, then this is one kitchen hack you need to try. This time, you can thank brown grandmas for passing it on to the mainstream. Even culinary scientists like Matt Slem vouch for this, and just like with sticky pasta, nobody enjoys eating sticky rice. Apple core pork stew sounded like a contradiction, but it worked better than you'd think. The cores, sticky, pitted, fibrous, weren't meant for pies, but for pots. They were dropped into a bubbling stew of pork scraps, mostly fat and bone, to balance out the salt with a hint of sweet. The sugars cooked down, the flavor spread. Apples and pork, an old pairing, but this was the budget version. The bones gave body, the cores gave brightness, and together they made something humble taste like something thoughtful. If you had onions, in they went. A splash of vinegar made it sing. Bread on the side, stale or not, caught whatever clung to the bottom of the bowl. You did not brag about this stew, but you asked for seconds, because it filled the belly and tricked the tongue into thinking someone had planned it. Apple core pork stew was a quiet reminder that sweetness often came from what others threw away. Sheepherder stew is a hearty, no-frills dish with its roots in the lives of Basque herders working in the rugged American West. Made with lamb or mutton, potatoes, onions, and often some peas or green beans, it's a stew that's as rustic as it comes. The simplicity of ingredients made it perfect for cooking over a campfire out on the open range, offering a warm and filling meal to fuel those long, chilly days spent with the flock. Lamb lends the stew a deep, earthy flavor, while the vegetables bring sweetness and depth, creating a dish that's straightforward but utterly comforting. Here's a fun tidbit. Basque sheepherders typically used a single pot for all their cooking, making stews like this a practical and satisfying choice. They'd throw in whatever ingredients they had at the moment, letting everything simmer together for a meal that was both homestyle and efficient. For an added layer of flavor true to tradition, try a splash of red wine or a pinch of rosemary, or even a handful of barley for extra heartiness. Pair it with some bread or biscuits, and sheepherder's stew becomes the ultimate one-pot wonder, perfect for chilly evenings when you crave something simple, rustic, and warming. It's a little taste of history in every spoonful, just waiting to cozy up your evening. Delaware was also serving seafood dinners, as the blue crab boil was a sought-after dinner. Famously covered in Old Bay seasoning, the blue crab boil came with rosemary, sage, pepper, and of course, the freshest crabs in Delaware. People would enjoy corn on the cob, potato wedges, and an assortment of grilled vegetables with the boil. Bacon rind stew was the art of borrowing flavor without spending meat. When the bacon was gone, the rinds, the tough, fatty edges, were what remained. Saved in coffee tins or wrapped in wax paper, they waited until the next stew. Dropped into water, they softened slowly, releasing salt, smoke, and the ghost of pork. Onions came next, maybe beans, maybe potatoes if the root cellar had not gone bare. The rind never disappeared completely. It just grew tender enough to chew if you dared, or fish out if you were polite. But the flavor lingered. It made the whole pot taste like bacon, even if there was no bacon in it. That was the trick. That was the genius. You fed a family on what most would have thrown away. The broth turned rich and deep. It smelled like Sunday. It felt like home, even if your shoes were patched and your coat too thin. Bacon rind stew did not pretend to be anything fancy, but it warmed the hands. It silenced the table, and it reminded everyone eating it that poverty could be proud, too. Dilled beef and cabbage stew is the ultimate in comfort food, adding a Scandinavian touch with the fresh, earthy flavor of dill. This hearty dish brings together tender beef chunks, cabbage, carrots, and potatoes, all uplifted by dill's herbaceous brightness. It's surprisingly refreshing for a winter stew, just right when you want something lighter than heavy gravies or sauces. Fun fact, cabbage is not just affordable but packed with vitamins C, K, and fiber, making it one of the healthiest veggies around. This recipe has its roots in Eastern European and Scandinavian kitchens, where cabbage was a winter staple, and Grandma knew it was a meal you could easily whip up from simple ingredients, yet still serve up a satisfying, flavorful dinner. For a little extra zing, add a splash of vinegar or a dollop of sour cream. Serve it with rye bread or boiled potatoes to soak up every drop of that tangy, herby broth. Cozy yet unique, this dilled beef and cabbage stew deserves a comeback as a winter classic. Meatier dinners were the best option in the 70s as bison steak became popular in Colorado. Bison was one of the most widely hunted animals in the state, with locals having a deep love for the meat. Steaks and American dinners complete each other, so it is no wonder that fresh bison steak with mashed potatoes and asparagus was a fan favorite. Sawdust dumpling stew did not have real sawdust, but you might have thought it did. It started with stale bread, so dry it crumbled like wood, and was shredded into dust, soaked in water, and mashed into a heavy paste. That paste got pinched into lumps, dropped into a weak broth made from bones or salted water, and boiled until swollen. The dumplings held their shape, barely. They were gray, dense, and heavy as stones. But they gave the illusion of a full pot. A single onion or garlic clove made it sing. Some added a splash of vinegar, others a pat of lard. But the dumplings were the point. They made you chew, they made you full, and they reminded you that bread, even at the end of its life, still had one more job to do. It was not elegant, but it was enough. And in kitchens where the wind blew through the cracks in the wall, that mattered more than taste. Coming back to more appealing dishes like the pot roast. The dish was first seen during the Great Depression when economic times were rough. Pot roast made a comeback in the 70s when Idaho took the basic recipe and added proteins like beef or chicken to create a delicious roast. This made for a perfect dinner as it was filling and would often be cooked in a higher quantity. To start off, Homestyle lamb casserole was a staple back in the day. What's not to love about tender pieces of lamb slow-cooked with root vegetables like carrots, potatoes, and parsnips in a rich, savory broth? Different versions of this casserole were often flavored with a blend of herbs such as rosemary, thyme, and bay leaves. This hot meal was a hit in the 1900s, especially in the colder months. Now, lamb casserole was not just about sustenance. It was about bringing the family together. It wasn't easy to whip up, so you really had to get your hands dirty and put in the work. Parents and grandparents would pass down their secret recipes and techniques, so the aroma of this hot meal never really left our dinner tables during winter holidays like Christmas. Unfortunately, tradition was trumped by convenience, and this lamb casserole has been pushed aside for quicker, less time-consuming options. Lamb shank and barley soup is another winter favorite that seems to have disappeared from our modern menus. Think fall-off-the-bone lamb shanks simmered in a flavorful broth with barley, fresh vegetables, and aromatic herbs. Barley added a nutty texture and made the soup even more filling. Sounds pretty good, right? Well, this soup was all the rave back in the day. Also known as the Scotch broth, it originated in Scotland in the early 19th century and made its way around to other countries in Europe. This soup was perfect for cold days as it wasn't only comforting and delicious, but was also packed with nutrients. Since it was light on the pocket, the lamb shank and barley soup were prepared in large batches and enjoyed by families for several days. It had a long shelf life too. What more could anyone want? With the rise of pre-packed and instant soups, this labor-intensive meal has fallen out of flavor. But if you're ever craving this winter meal, there are millions of recipes all over the internet. So high pie is a traditional dish from the 17th century that might sound intimidating, but it's actually delicious and surprisingly easy to make. If you're ever feeling like whipping a fancy meal on a cold snow day, high pie is your best friend. If high pie doesn't ring a bell, you might know it as raised pie. Strike a note? This unique pie was made using a hot water crust pastry, which allowed the pie to be formed by hand into a high, sturdy shape. But here's the twist. Instead of a pastry crust, it's topped with a layer of mashed potatoes. The best part? It can be filled with anything from ground beef and vegetables to braised chicken. High pies were often reserved for special occasions or holidays, as they required significant time and effort to prepare. The hype for high pie has died down over time, but it's still a staple in some homes who can't seem to let it go, especially during the winter months. Grandma's curried sausages, a nostalgic winter favorite, have largely disappeared from modern dining tables. This dish featured sausages cooked in a mildly spiced curry sauce, often made with onions, apples, and a touch of cream. The combination of savory sausages and the sweet, spicy sauce made it a comforting and flavorful meal. Curried sausages were often served with rice or mashed potatoes, which helped to balance the rich flavors of the sauce. This dish was a staple in many households, particularly during the colder months, providing warmth and nourishment. However, with the rise of new culinary trends and the availability of more diverse meal options, Grandma's curried sausages have become a rarity. Their disappearance marks the loss of a comforting, home-cooked dish that brought families together around the dinner table. One of the most widespread hacks that got around like wildfire in the USA was the idea of speeding up the process of caramelizing onions by adding in some baking soda. Baking soda is a handy tool for many tasks, like softening vegetables or removing pesky stains. In the case of onions, it creates a pretty volatile pH environment, which helps the onions brown faster, better, and with a much richer flavor. This has to do with onions being more alkaline post-baking soda, and that really helps speed up the browning process. If you want to cut down on the prep time of your food without sacrificing the taste, and you find yourself putting in caramelized onions a lot, then this is one hack from Grandma to us to you. This is a very classic dish that was often prepared by Grandma in winter. Do not be put off by the word rabbit. It's a tender, lean meat, with a mild flavor that's often compared to chicken, but with a bit more character. Oh, and by the way, I'm talking about rabbit stew. The meat of rabbit is rich in proteins and comparatively has less fat content than most meats. Now, this stew defines comfort and health altogether. The basic ingredients for rabbit stew are root vegetables such as carrots, potatoes, onions, and mushrooms cooked in a meaty gravy. This dish has deep roots in European cooking, especially in France and Italy, where rabbits were a backyard staple. Fun fact: rabbit meat is probably one of the world's most eco-friendly sources of meat since it needs fewer resources for production than other meats such as beef. To get the best out of your rabbit stew, cook it low and slow, letting the meat fall off the bone and infuse the broth with a rich, gamey flavor. If you're feeling adventurous, pour a few spoonfuls of red wine into the pot, or spice it up with a few twirls of thyme and rosemary. Accompany it with a crusty loaf of bread for the bread-dipping accompaniment, and you've got yourself a stew that's comforting, tangy, and a tad exotic, a real winter favorite that needs a revival. Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce, such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. It's a part of ancient history now, but you might be able to taste it if you make your way to Regal Balls or a Michelin star restaurant in London. Squirrel stew might make you do a double take, but it was once a staple food in rural America, especially in the South. Think of it as the original farm-to-table meal before that term was trendy. Squirrel meat is surprisingly lean, with the flavor somewhere between chicken and rabbit. Plus, it's tender and flavorful when slow cooked. Pair it with vegetables like carrots, onions, and potatoes. Maybe add a little cider vinegar or a handful of herbs, and you've got a stew like no other. Why squirrel, you ask? During the Great Depression, people turned to this common critter as an easily available source of protein. Squirrels are plentiful and easy to find. Therefore, it was not unusual for Grandma to throw a squirrel into the pot. In fact, some regions still celebrate the tradition, with squirrel stew cook-offs and recipes passed down through generations. Squirrel meat has been shown to have more protein per gram than beef or chicken. Therefore, it is nutritious and unique. If you're game to try this classic, remember that it's all about seasoning. Bay leaves, thyme, and even a little hot sauce can make this stew delicious and memorable. Embrace your pioneering spirit with a bowl of squirrel stew. It is very delicious and extremely nostalgic. Brunswick stew is both heartwarming and mysterious. Its true origins are still a matter of debate. Brunswick County, Virginia, and Brunswick County, Georgia, claim to be the birthplace of this tomato-rich stew, which dates back to the 19th century. Regardless of its origin, Brunswick stew has always been about using local, seasonal ingredients and stretching them to feed a crowd. Traditional recipes used wild animals such as squirrels or rabbits, but nowadays chicken and pork are the usual protein pick for this stew. The stew is thickened with crushed tomatoes, chicken, and lima seeds, sometimes adding a little barbecue sauce for an extra smokiness. Long ago, this dish was a communal affair, made in massive pots and often cooked over a wood fire for hours until every ingredient was melt-in-your-mouth tender. In Brunswick, Georgia, there's a 25-gallon cast iron pot that claims to be the original Brunswick stew pot. It's big enough to feed an entire town. Southerners have been known to argue over whose Brunswick stew is best, with each family passing down their own secret recipe. But whether you're making it for a crowd or just stocking up in the freezer, Brunswick stew will fill your kitchen with the scent of comfort and nostalgia. Flour paste stew was what happened when flour, water, and hope met in a single pot. A roux of sorts, but made with margarine instead of butter and water instead of broth. Stirred over low heat until it thickened into a pale, gluey base. Salted, maybe peppered, and then extended with whatever scraps remained. Bits of carrot, half a potato, dried onion flakes, or even a spoonful of mustard. It clung to the spoon. It filled the bowl. It didn't look like much, but it had weight. It stayed in the stomach. That was the goal. Children called it paste stew and giggled, but they ate it anyway. It was warm. It was filling. It gave the illusion of plenty. Some added canned meat, others just breadcrumbs. The goal wasn't flavor. It was fuel, and it worked. Flour paste stew was the definition of making do, of thickening up nothing until it felt like something. It may have stuck to the pot and to the ribs, but it also stuck in the memory as one more way people refused to go hungry. Hungarian goulash, despite its name, is not a soup, but rather a stew with a lot of punch because of its secret ingredient, paprika. This rustic dish combines tender chunks of beef, onions, bell peppers, and potatoes, all cooked in a rich, spiced broth that's as colorful as it is flavorful. Hungarian goulash is thicker than soup but finer than the real stew, hence can be referred to as comfort food, not being too dense but still hearty. This classic dish has been around since the 9th century, originally cooked by Hungarian herdsmen over open fires. Fun fact, real Hungarian goulash mainly uses Hungarian paprika, which provides the dish the smoky sweet flavor and the bright red hue. For it to have that traditional feel, it should be served with either egg noodles or dumplings to accompany the soup. For a richer taste, you could sprinkle caraway seeds or a little sour cream on top. Hungarian goulash is more than just a meal. It's a taste of history, warmth, and old-world charm that's perfect for a cold winter's night. This is definitely a stew that will make you feel like you are in Hungary with every spoonful. The best homemade meal, in my opinion, was lasagna. Nowadays, people enjoy this dish on laid-back Saturday afternoons. And to be honest, I agree. Leave it in the oven for an hour, and a cheesy-filled indulgence is born. These components include the basic kitchen must-haves, layers of lasagna sheets, pasta sauce, and some cheese, of course. It has met those expectations of the history books as well. Did you know that its origins are implanted in the backstories of ancient Greece? Yes, you heard me right. This was not an original Italian cuisine. Nevertheless, many dispute that the first record of such a recipe being written down dates back to Naples during the Middle Ages. But wherever it started, it's now seen as a go-to dish in any household, no matter the country. Cabbage roll stew is a variation of the stuffed cabbage rolls, but easier to prepare because it's a one-pot dish. To make it, you take ground beef or pork, rice, tomatoes, and cabbages, and cook them in a rich broth that is slightly sour. Cabbage rolls without having to roll a cabbage. In other words, a way to get that yummy, intense flavor with less effort. The preparation of the cabbage rolls is maybe several centuries old, and it is a kitchen staple of the people of southeastern Europe. Fun fact, cabbage rolls were traditionally served at celebrations, symbolizing prosperity and abundance. This stew variation is easier to make, saving you time without sacrificing flavor. Sprinkle a tiny bit of paprika or bay leaf to make it tastier, and serve it with bread to capture all the tomato broth. This cabbage roll stew can warm your bones as no other stew can. Without the complexities of cabbage rolls, it's cozy, filling, and absolutely delicious, a taste of the old world in a modern, lazy day dish. Ketchup soup stew started out as a joke, but not the funny kind. When the tomatoes were gone and the cans were too expensive, families reached for what little sweetness they had left. Packets, pumps, and sticky bottles of ketchup. 2 or 3 squirts, some boiling water, and a prayer. Add elbow noodles or rice if you had it. maybe half an onion, chopped thin enough to melt. The ketchup colored the broth red, tricking the eye into believing it was tomato stew. It was not. But that was the trick. That was the magic. Your grandfather might have slurped it down and said, "Tastes just like Heinz." But no one was laughing. This was what you ate when the only store left was the diner's condiment counter. Sometimes a piece of bread got dunked in. Sometimes a cheese rind floated like a lifeboat. It was survival, disguised in red. And no one ever forgot the taste, not because it was good, but because it meant someone still tried to make a meal out of nothing. If these forgotten soups sparked a taste of nostalgia, drop a comment, hit that like button, and subscribe.